It was a quiet morning in a quiet French town. Nothing seemed out of place. The sun rose over the rooftops of Pont Saint-Esprit, just like it had every day before. Bakers set out warm loaves of bread. Children walked to school. Farmers fed their animals. Shopkeepers opened their shutters. And then, something strange began to happen. A man claimed snakes were crawling up the walls of his home. Another said his head was made of copper and he was being melted from the inside. A third jumped into a river because he believed fire was chasing him. One man tried to strangle his wife in a fit of blind terror. Another leapt from a second-story window, convinced he could fly. It wasn't a horror film. It was real. It happened in 1951. And no one, not the townspeople, not the doctors, not the police, could explain what was going on. Welcome to the true and chilling story of a town that lost its grip on reality. A story of poison, mystery, and madness, where a single bite of bread could pull you into a nightmare. This is the tale of mass hallucination, government suspicion, and a fungus that might have changed history. But before you get comfortable, make sure to like and subscribe if you find these stories interesting. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always so fascinating connecting with people from around the world. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, close your eyes, and just listen. Let your mind drift. There's no need to remember anything. This story is here to keep you company as you rest. Let's begin. The story of bread and madness goes back far earlier than 1951. The strange event in Pont Saint-Esprit is just the most famous of many outbreaks that, for centuries, terrified communities across Europe. In the Middle Ages, entire villages would sometimes fall into what seemed like mass hysteria. People would convulse in the streets. They'd scream about demons or witches. They'd claw at their own bodies or rip off their clothes. Sometimes, they'd dance uncontrollably for hours or even days, unable to stop as if possessed. Clerics called it holy fire. Others called it dancing plague. But the most likely culprit was something hiding in their food, specifically in the rye. Ergot is a fungus. It grows on rye grain when the weather is wet and cool. To the naked eye, it looks like a dark, hard growth, a shriveled spike on the tip of a rye stalk. It's easy to miss during harvest. But once it's ground into flour and baked into bread, the effects can be extraordinary, because ergot contains alkaloids chemically similar to LSD. That's right, centuries before chemists synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide in a lab, villagers in Europe were tripping involuntarily because of moldy bread. The symptoms were horrific: hallucinations, seizures, burning sensations in the limbs. Some people felt like ants were crawling under their skin. Others thought their fingers were on fire. Limbs would go numb and sometimes rot. People would scream that they were being dragged to hell. The condition became known as St. Anthony's fire, named after a Christian monk whose followers were said to heal the afflicted. Pilgrims would travel great distances to seek relief, often crawling on their knees, clutching their blistered skin. Some survived, many did not. And yet, no one understood the cause. For centuries, it was blamed on curses, on the devil, on sin. Some communities thought it was divine punishment. Others feared witches. Entire groups were persecuted because someone nearby had gone mad after eating cursed bread. But it wasn't magic, it was mold. By the time ergotism had a name, it had already shaped history. The symptoms varied, but they were often extreme and terrifying. There were two primary types: convulsive and gangrenous. In convulsive ergotism, people experience violent muscle spasms, hallucinations, and seizures. Their minds betrayed them. Visions of monsters, voices in their heads, overwhelming paranoia. In gangrenous ergotism, the blood vessels in the limbs would constrict, leading to burning pain, blisters, and eventually blackened dead flesh. Fingers and toes would fall off. Entire limbs could rot away. It was a slow, terrifying decay, and there was no known cure. In 944 AD, in the region that is now France, nearly 40,000 people reportedly died in a single outbreak. The sheer scale of the suffering baffled physicians and priests alike. Was it divine retribution? Was it a curse? Few suspected the bread itself. After all, bread was sacred. It was the staff of life, a holy symbol in Christian ritual. The idea that it could betray the body and mind, turning nourishment into torment, was too disturbing for many to accept. Still, the outbreaks continued. In the 16th and 17th centuries, ergotism would appear sporadically across Europe, particularly in poor, rural regions where rye was a dietary staple. Whole families would be stricken. Farm animals, too, would fall ill if fed the infected grain. Entire villages would be marked by the illness, limping survivors, amputees, and stories of those who went mad and wandered into the woods, never to return. And yet, the connection between the fungus and the disease remained unclear. That wouldn't change until centuries later. Enter 20th century France. The town of Pont-Saint-Esprit sat quietly in southern France, nestled between the Rhône River and the Languedoc Hills. In the summer of 1951, it was unremarkable. About 5,000 people lived there. Most were farmers, shopkeepers, or workers in the nearby cellulose factory. Life was predictable, comfortable even, until August 15th. That day, a strange illness swept through the town. It began subtly. A few people complained of nausea, of stomach pains. Then came the headaches. Then, bizarre behaviors. A 10-year-old boy tried to strangle his grandmother. An elderly woman reported seeing tigers in her curtains. A man claimed he was shrinking. Another ran down the street screaming that his skin was melting. People were crawling on the ground, hallucinating that snakes were wrapping around their legs. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Beds filled with patients trembling, screaming, writhing. Doctors were horrified. This wasn't like anything they'd seen before. Some patients became violent. Others went catatonic. One man reportedly leapt from a second-story window to escape the demons he saw chasing him. 7 people died. Over 250 fell violently ill. Dozens were committed to psychiatric institutions. Investigators were dispatched immediately. At first, they suspected poisoning. Perhaps a local crop had been contaminated. Or maybe the water supply was tainted. But tests came back negative. Attention quickly turned to the bakeries. Nearly all the afflicted had eaten bread purchased from a single local bakery. The owner, distraught, insisted he had done nothing unusual. He used the same suppliers as always. The flour came from a nearby mill, which in turn sourced grain from farms across the region. Still, samples were taken, and in the flour investigators found traces of a familiar culprit, ergot. But this was confusing. Ergot outbreaks were rare by the mid-20th century. Modern farming techniques, grain inspections, and milling processes should have caught the contamination. And yet, here it was, ancient terror reborn. Not everyone was convinced. Some investigators suggested the outbreak may not have been ergotism at all. They noted that symptoms appeared too quickly and were unusually intense. Others pointed out inconsistencies in the reported illnesses. A few even suggested mass hysteria, arguing that fear had spread faster than the fungus. But the theory that drew the most attention and controversy was something altogether darker. Whispers began to circulate. What if the poisoning wasn't an accident? What if it had been a test? The rumor began as a whisper in the margins, an uneasy theory dismissed by many, but never fully extinguished. What if the 1951 Pont Saint-Esprit outbreak wasn't a tragedy of spoiled grain? What if it was a test, a deliberate experiment? The theory gained momentum in the decades that followed, fueled by journalists, conspiracy theorists, and even a few former intelligence agents. In 2009, investigative journalist Hank P. Albarelli Jr. published a book claiming that the incident was part of a covert CIA program. According to Albarelli, newly declassified documents revealed that Pont Saint-Esprit may have been targeted by MK Ultra, a now infamous program run by the US Central Intelligence Agency to research mind control, interrogation techniques, and psychological warfare. According to this theory, the CIA had been experimenting with LSD and other psychoactive substances on both willing and unwilling subjects during the Cold War. The logic was clear. If you could influence a person's thoughts, induce fear, compliance, or confusion, you could control enemies without firing a shot. But practicing that control required data, and data required test subjects. Albarelli cited a memo allegedly written by a CIA official, which mentioned Pont Saint-Esprit by name. The claim was that agents introduced LSD into the local food supply to observe its effects on an unwitting population. If true, it would mean that dozens of people had suffered, and several had died, not because of mold, but because of a clandestine foreign experiment carried out on Allied soil. The French government has never confirmed the theory. The US government denies it outright, and many scientists still believe the simpler explanation, ergot. Ergot contamination, after all, has been documented for centuries. It explains the symptoms. It explains the link to the bread. It doesn't require espionage. But still, the doubt lingers. Whether it was a chemical mishap or an act of sabotage, the incident at Pont Saint-Esprit serves as a chilling reminder of how fragile reality can be. One bite, one loaf, and the entire fabric of your world begins to warp. But let's step back even further. The story of ergot is not just one of madness and hallucination. It's a story of transformation. Because the same fungus that tormented villagers and frightened doctors also holds within it the key to one of the most powerful substances ever discovered, LSD. In 1938, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was working at Sandoz Laboratories, experimenting with derivatives of ergot. His goal was to find a stimulant for the respiratory and circulatory systems. What he synthesized was lysergic acid diethylamide, compound number 25 in a long line of failed chemical experiments. LSD-25. Initially, it was set aside. It seemed to have no useful properties. But in 1943, Hofmann decided to revisit the compound. While resynthesizing it, he accidentally absorbed a small amount through his fingertips. The result? He became dizzy, anxious. He began to hallucinate. Curious, he tried a more intentional dose days later and embarked on what would become one of the most legendary drug experiences in modern history. On April 19th, 1943, now known as Bicycle Day, Hofmann rode his bike home while under the influence of the world's first deliberate LSD trip. Colors intensified, time warped, the world twisted around him in a kaleidoscope of sensation, and it had all come from the same fungus that once haunted medieval Europe. Suddenly, ergot wasn't just a footnote in toxicology textbooks. It was the source of a new frontier in psychiatry, consciousness, and yes, government experimentation. By the 1950s and 60s, LSD was being studied for its potential to treat alcoholism, depression, and anxiety. At the same time, intelligence agencies were exploring its darker possibilities. MKULTRA began dosing unwitting subjects in prisons, hospitals, and even bars. The idea was to break down the human mind and build it back up in ways more compliant, more useful. So when Pont Saint-Esprit fell into madness in 1951, it wasn't entirely far-fetched for some to suspect human hands behind the chaos. Whether it was mold or malice, the result was the same. A town that lost its mind, bread that betrayed the body, and a story that reminds us how thin the boundary can be between nourishment and nightmare. The question of why people kept eating the bread, even after it made them sick, is one worth pausing on, because it gets at something deeper, not just about food or fungus or paranoia, but about trust. In 1951, bread was more than just breakfast. It was ritual. It was identity. In Pont Saint-Esprit, as in many parts of France, bread wasn't a side dish. It was the heart of every meal. Families would send their children to the bakery before sunrise. People would walk home with still warm loaves cradled in paper sleeves. It was a symbol of routine, of comfort, of life proceeding exactly as it always had. So when people got sick, they didn't blame the bread at first. They blamed the weather, the flu, stress, maybe a bad dream, but not the loaf. That's how deep the trust ran. Even after reports of seizures and hallucinations spread, many residents continued to eat it. Maybe the stories were exaggerated. Maybe it was just a bad batch. But even then, how could something so essential, so pure, so French be the cause? The bakery that had sold most of the contaminated bread became the center of an investigation and of public fury. Its owner, a man named Roche, was devastated. He had used flour from the usual distributor, followed the same recipes, baked in the same ovens. He swore he had done nothing differently, and he may have been telling the truth. The flour itself had come from a mill in the nearby town of Charmes-sur-Rhône. From there, it had travelled through standard distribution channels to the bakeries of Pont Saint-Esprit. Investigators traced it back to a larger network of regional grain suppliers. What they found disturbed them. The batch of flour in question had passed through several hands. It was part of a last-minute redistribution effort, rushed due to shortages. The wheat had been stored in humid conditions, possibly for weeks. That, combined with the naturally damp summer, may have allowed ergot to flourish on the rye crop before it was ever milled. This wasn't sabotage, it was neglect. But even that explanation wasn't enough for everyone. Ergotism is rare in modern history for a reason. Food inspections, storage regulations, better awareness. It takes a specific mix of poor oversight, bad weather, and bad luck to create the right conditions for an outbreak. And yet, all those conditions seem to converge in 1951. It wasn't the only modern case. In Ethiopia, during the 1970s, and again in the early 2000s, outbreaks of ergot poisoning occurred in rural areas where rye was consumed regularly. Dozens of villages suffered symptoms similar to those described in medieval Europe. Ergot, it turned out, had not been banished. It had simply gone into hiding, waiting for the right conditions to return. What's interesting is how long it took science to catch up. The term ergotism wasn't used in a medical sense until the 19th century. Before that, it went by dozens of names: Holy Fire, Plague of Fire, St. Anthony's Fire. And while folk healers had their theories, the biological mechanism was a mystery. It wasn't until the 1800s that scientists began to isolate the alkaloids responsible for its effects. That discovery was revolutionary. It not only helped explain the mysterious epidemics of the past, but also opened the door to new medicines. Ergot derivatives were used to treat migraines, induce labor, and stop postpartum bleeding. One compound, ergotamine, is still used in migraine treatment today. But the story of ergot isn't just about medicine or madness. It's also about how fear spreads. In 1951, once the media caught wind of the outbreak, headlines exploded. Village goes mad. Demon bread strikes again. Reporters from Paris and London descended on Pont Saint-Esprit. Photographers snapped images of patients writhing in hospital beds, of bakeries being boarded up, of forensic teams testing flour samples with long tweezers and furrowed brows. The town, once anonymous, was suddenly infamous, and that notoriety never truly faded. Even decades later, Pont Saint-Esprit remains a symbol of unexplained illness, of food-borne terror, and of the strange ways our minds can betray us when something as fundamental as bread turns against us. In the aftermath, there were lawsuits. Families demanded compensation. The French government promised reform. Flour regulations were tightened. Storage inspections became more rigorous. But the damage had already been done, not just to the bodies of those affected, but to the psyche of an entire generation. What made the 1951 outbreak so unsettling wasn't just the symptoms themselves, it was how utterly random it seemed. Who got sick and who didn't felt almost arbitrary. Entire households were spared while neighbors collapsed in the streets. People who ate from the same loaf experienced vastly different reactions. Some hallucinated, others vomited, a few felt nothing at all. That randomness fed the paranoia. Doctors at the local hospital, overwhelmed and unsure, began to separate patients by symptom type. Those exhibiting extreme psychosis were placed in psychiatric wards. while others with convulsions and vomiting were treated for possible poisoning. But even the most seasoned physicians had no answers. Psychogenic illness, one specialist muttered. Mass hysteria, another suggested. Food-borne neurotoxin, said a third. Everyone agreed something had gone terribly wrong, but consensus, that was harder to come by. Meanwhile, the victims suffered. One man said he saw flowers blooming from his arms. A woman wept uncontrollably for hours, then screamed that she had no bones. A local farmer, formerly quiet and reserved, stood in the middle of the town square shouting that his insides had turned to glass. At least 4 people attempted suicide. Many more were restrained. A few had to be sedated for days at a time. And yet, through it all, one thing was strangely absent: a formal public statement. For weeks, neither the French government nor the local authorities issued an official explanation. The bakery owner was briefly detained, then released. The flour mill was inspected, but not shut down. Villagers, left to piece together their own understanding, turned to rumor. Some believed the town had been cursed. Others thought it was divine punishment. A few blamed the Americans, who were still a dominant force in post-war Europe. They're testing something, people whispered. They're experimenting on us. This theory found an eager audience in the years that followed, because the 1950s weren't just the age of recovery. They were the dawn of Cold War paranoia. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent arms race, not just of missiles, but of minds. Psychological warfare became the new frontier. Governments around the world funneled millions into the study of manipulation, brainwashing, and chemical control. France, newly rebuilding its institutions, was not immune to these influences. And Pont-Saint-Esprit, small and quiet, offered a convenient test site if one were so inclined. Which brings us back to the mysterious memo uncovered by Hank Albarelli. According to his research, a CIA document described a successful field trial of a psychoactive compound in a rural French community. The timing matched. The symptoms matched. The implication was chilling. If this was true, if the outbreak had been orchestrated, then it was one of the earliest examples of non-consensual psychedelic testing on civilians. Long before MK Ultra became a public scandal, before congressional hearings exposed its darker truths, Pont-Saint-Esprit may have been its proving ground. But here's the thing. Even if that theory were true, no one has ever been held accountable. No official apologies. No classified documents fully declassified. No names. Just speculation and pain. For the survivors, the debate over ergot versus LSD mattered little. Their lives had been upended. Some never recovered. Nightmares persisted. Fear lingered. One man, a teenager at the time, later described the incident as the moment I stopped trusting the world. He remembered his own hallucination, giant spiders crawling over his skin, and the way his mother sobbed when she couldn't wake him from it. He didn't eat bread again for nearly a year, and still the world moved on. The story faded from headlines. Pont-Saint-Esprit returned to quiet. The bakery reopened under new ownership. Children went back to school. Crops were harvested. Meals resumed. But the scar remained. Today, there's no plaque in the town square. No official memorial. If you ask locals about the event, many will shrug. It happened long ago, they'll say. We don't talk about it. And yet, deep in the archives of both France and the US, the files still sit. Redacted, dusty, incomplete. The truth may lie there, waiting to be discovered, or waiting to be forgotten. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what happened, it's what might have. The deeper we look into the history of ergot, the clearer it becomes that its role in shaping human history goes far beyond any single town or time period. Some historians have gone so far as to argue that ergotism influenced some of the most pivotal social panics of the Western world, including, perhaps most famously, the Salem witch trials. It's a theory that gained traction in the 1970s when a behavioral scientist named Linda Caparel proposed that the strange symptoms reported in Salem, visions, convulsions, bizarre behavior, even the infamous fits, bore a striking resemblance to documented ergot poisoning cases. Her hypothesis suggested that the girls who accused their neighbors of witchcraft had, in fact, eaten bread contaminated with the same toxic fungus that would strike Pont Saint-Esprit centuries later. The soil conditions in colonial Massachusetts were ideal for rye cultivation, and in wet, humid seasons, those same conditions could promote the growth of Claviceps purpurea. Caporale even cited weather data to support her claim. Records showed that the spring and summer of 1691 had been particularly damp. The timeline fit. If true, it would mean that the hysteria that led to 20 executions and hundreds of ruined lives may have begun not with the devil, but with a tainted loaf of rye bread. Not all historians agree, of course. Some argue that the witch trials were driven more by social tension, political factionalism, and religious fervor than by neurotoxins. Others note that the symptoms weren't consistent across all accusers, and that records may have exaggerated the more theatrical aspects of the girls' behavior. Still, the theory remains tantalizing. It offers a naturalistic explanation for an otherwise baffling and tragic chapter of American history. It also illustrates the core danger of ergot. It mimics madness. It blurs the line between the real and the imagined, between sickness and sin, between natural affliction and supernatural threat. In an age before modern psychiatry or food science, ergotism could look like possession, or heresy, or guilt. And because the symptoms were invisible until they weren't, because they lurked in the mundane ritual of eating, they seemed to come from nowhere. One moment you were whole, the next, screaming at shadows. This, perhaps, is why ergot has fascinated not just scientists, but artists. The surrealists, the expressionists, the writers of early science fiction, all have, in one way or another, drawn from the idea of a world that seems normal until it isn't. A world that flips, betrays, twists. Just as bread once did in Pont Saint-Esprit. There are even those who speculate that earlier reports of demonic possession in the Middle Ages were also cases of ergot poisoning. Monks in monasteries reporting vivid visions, entire villages writhing in collective ecstasy or agony, saints who claim to feel divine fire in their veins. It all matches, at least loosely, with ergot's known effects. Was it all chemical? Of course not. But perhaps some of it was. Enough to blur the line. Enough to remind us that history is often told through the lens of what we think we understand. and foodborne toxins have always had a way of slipping through that lens, unseen, uncredited. In Pont Saint-Esprit, the survivors eventually healed, at least physically. The psychiatric scars were longer lasting. A handful of patients remained in institutions for years. Some never fully recovered their memories. Others recalled fragmented nightmares, lingering anxiety, a fear of food they could not explain. But perhaps the strangest legacy of the Pont Saint-Esprit outbreak is what came after. Because despite the horror it unleashed, the event also reinvigorated interest in ergot, not just as a toxic threat, but as a potential medical tool. Research into ergot alkaloids expanded. Scientists began isolating new derivatives, testing their impact on blood pressure, neurological pathways, and mood regulation. LSD, of course, had already arrived, but now there were new compounds, more precise, less volatile, medications that could constrict blood vessels during migraines, drugs that could stimulate contractions during childbirth, even experimental treatments for schizophrenia and depression. In this way, ergot became something stranger than fiction, a poison that also healed, a fungus that ruined minds and then saved them. Pont Saint-Esprit, the town that had suffered so much, unwittingly became a catalyst for scientific progress, even as the whispers of government conspiracy lingered, even as the scars never quite faded. In the years that followed the outbreak at Pont Saint-Esprit, one question continued to haunt both scientists and laypeople alike. How could something so old still catch us off guard? Ergot had been known to humanity for centuries. The Middle Ages were full of stories of the holy fire, of entire villages overcome by convulsions, hallucinations, and burning pain. People once believed it was divine punishment. Others saw it as the work of witches. The truth, an unassuming fungus that thrived on damp grain, was somehow even more terrifying, because it was invisible, and it was natural. So why, in 1951, had no one seen it coming? Part of the answer lies in the false sense of security that modernity brings. Post-war France was rebuilding, yes, but it was also innovating. It had new trains, new factories, new scientific institutions. People believed they had moved beyond medieval afflictions. Food was regulated, health officials existed, technology would protect them, until it didn't. What Pont Saint-Esprit showed was that even the most basic assumptions, like the safety of your bread, could be shattered. That fear lodged itself in the French public consciousness. Not just fear of poisoning, but fear of oversight failure. It turned out systems didn't always work. Governments weren't always watching, and science didn't always have an answer. This skepticism wasn't limited to France. In the United States, the 1950s brought about a strange duality. On one hand, it was the golden age of consumerism, shiny appliances, processed foods, frozen dinners. On the other hand, it was also the age of suspicion, of red scares, of classified projects, of a growing awareness that science could be used not just for progress, but for control. This is the soil in which the conspiracy theories about Pont Saint-Esprit took root. Because when you think about it, how could a quiet French town be struck by such bizarre symptoms? Visions, madness, death. without someone having seen it coming, without some larger force behind it. As MK Ultra came to light decades later, it became easier to retroactively paint Pont Saint-Esprit as its first casualty. Did it happen? We don't know, but the possibility, however remote, was enough to shift the story from tragedy to mystery, and that's where it still sits today. Meanwhile, in laboratories and universities, ergot remained a puzzle of its own. Its alkaloids, dozens of them, presented a treasure trove of medical potential. Researchers began to understand how subtly ergot could influence the body, constricting blood vessels, triggering neurotransmitters, mimicking natural hormones. Some derivatives could save lives. Others, if used improperly, could take them. It became clear that the boundary between medicine and toxin was razor thin. This duality gave ergot a sort of mythic status. To doctors, it was a promising tool. To historians, a deadly relic. To conspiracy theorists, the root of modern psychological warfare. And to the villagers of Pont Saint-Esprit, it was something more personal. A wound. A warning. There are few first-person accounts of the incident that survive today, but one comes from a woman named Colette Rimbaud. She was a teenager when it happened, the daughter of a local teacher. She remembers the bread, how sweet it had smelled that morning, how excited she had been to eat it with jam. Within an hour, she felt dizzy. Then she couldn't stop laughing, then crying. Her mother collapsed beside her. Her father began shouting that wolves were at the door. They spent the night in the hospital, unsure if they'd ever leave. Years later, Colette described that day as a betrayal by something sacred. The bread, she said, was like family. To have it turn on them was like being abandoned. This emotional component often gets overlooked in scientific discussions, but it's crucial, because when food becomes dangerous, it's not just your body that's attacked, it's your sense of safety, your connection to the rhythms of daily life, the small rituals that make up your identity. Some claim that on stormy nights you can still hear laughter echoing in the streets, or see lights dancing where no one walks. Most dismiss these as ghost stories, but they hint at a deeper memory. One etched not just in documents or archives, but in culture. Because what happened in Pont Saint-Esprit wasn't just a medical mystery, it was a rupture in the ordinary. A moment when the most basic act, eating bread, became a portal to madness. And in that moment, a town learned how fragile normal life really is. To this day, the full truth remains just out of reach. Maybe it always will. But the story lives on, quietly, persistently, in bakeries, in archives, in the minds of those who dare to wonder. What if it happened again? And would we even see it coming?